Welcome to Security Architecture Podcast, where we help cybersecurity professionals to stay ahead of the curve and ensure they are successful in their cybersecurity journey.
Good afternoon, I'm Evgeny, and we have Bitglass here, and Mike is from Bitglass, and we'll begin talking about SASE. Mike, can you please talk and introduce a bit more about Bitglass and what you guys do?
Sure. Bitglass was originally a CASB that was founded back in 2013. We've been focused on proxy-based controls for the entirety of the company. The company was founded around protecting mobile devices and kind of the confluence of people being outside of the office and accessing from really anywhere. And so we saw that coming as a huge thing. And we've been basically protecting devices in this manner since 2014. Basically, what we do is we provide a multi-mode CASB capability that allows you to connect both to managed applications and unmanaged apps and control them and whatnot. And more recently, we've rolled out a capability with respect to SASE, which is that Gartner term associated with kind of the joining of cloud security and network security to provide things like the outbound browsing controls and whatnot that we're going to focus on today.
Yes, thank you. And this is the main part of our conversation today.
Mm-hmm.
So we will start with the questions.
The first question that we would like to ask is, what's the name of the offering that's addressing the outbound browsing?
Is the Smart Edge Secure Web Gateway. And I'll explain a little bit more of what that means once we get to it in a moment.
Awesome. So you just spoke that SASE is the new term for a category of products that we actually spoke in episode 2 in our podcast, explain more about this. And you just mentioned that you're covering multiple categories as part of it. If I understand correctly, you're covering the CASB part and the outbound browsing, correct?
Yeah, definitely. So there's all kinds of different types of solutions combined together, basically, under this umbrella of CASB per se. And so from a SASE perspective, what the prediction was, as outlined by Gartner in, I think it was August of 2019, was that these cloud security type components, things like CASB, things like Secure Web Gateway, things like Zero Trust Network Access and Software Defined Perimeter, things like DNS-based controls, more on the networking side, QoS, Firewalls as a Service, SD-WAN, and whatnot, all these products will come together, right? And so as they come together, the services that they're basically providing are abilities to control things like managed apps, things like unmanaged apps, things like outbound browsing, right? But the idea is that in 3 to 6 years, the solutions will be basically all SASE, and the idea being that everything is provided from a cloud-based service as opposed to deploying things on premise like people were doing in the past.
So basically as a service, in a way.
Totally, yes.
So you mentioned that SASE, the outbound part, is relatively new to Bitglass. Can you explain how you define the maturity of the product and what you guys been doing so far with the outbound browsing?
Yeah, so I mean, we've had controls like this probably since the GA in 2014. The focus there was more on controlling things like, actually it's kind of cool, but controlling things like applications where you might want to make an application read-only. So we have a forward proxy solution that allows you to take an app and say it's a social media application like Facebook, or say it's just a general email web client, and I log in and I go to Yahoo, let's say. We wanted to offer an opportunity for someone to be able to log into those apps and use them, but not necessarily to upload any data, because it might be corporate data coming from a managed device, and that would be kind of an exfiltration type approach. And so from a maturity perspective, what we've introduced in the last, 6 to 9 months has been, we announced the availability of the product back in November of 2019, and it went GA basically in Q2 of 2020. What that is more focused on kind of broader swath of applications. So instead of saying, hey, I want to control Facebook, or hey, I want to control Yahoo, now you can say, I want to control web-based email as a category as a whole. And we've also introduced other things like looking up reputations of sites. So I can say, hey, this is a low reputation site, so I might want to block it. Tying in also with our capabilities associated with the discovery database and Shadow IT, we also allow you to control things that aren't just, gambling and pornography and malware threats and phishing links and things like that, but also capabilities around saying, this is a file sharing service, or this is a CRM application. and it has a score that's maybe between 1 and 10. If it's below a 5, I'm going to block it, or I'm going to control it in some way. So we've combined basically the secure web gateway and the CASB capabilities all into one thing for outbound browsing.
Who's controlling the score in this case? Is you, or you rely on somebody else?
So there's two pieces. One, we partnered with WebRoot to provide the categorization for the web browsing categories. So the web browsing categories are associated with things like those gamblings and malware sites and whatnot. But when you think about the actual applications that people are using for business on an everyday basis, things like Marketo and Salesforce and Office 365, what tends to happen is they fall under computers and internet info, just kind of as a broad swath of apps that are that way. So what we've done is we've combined our CASB Shadow IT capability that breaks down over 80,000 different apps in these business categories, as well as 600,000 apps in general, to classify the data and allow you finer granularity. So there you can say CRM versus file sharing versus content management system and whatnot, which doesn't really exist in typical secure web gateway type category set.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the next question would be around your licensing. So how would you license your product to by users, by devices, connections, bandwidth?
So we've seen a lot of complexity associated with other vendors in particular trying to license things more on a network type focus. So they talk about things like concurrent connections, like you mentioned, or bandwidth and whatnot. And we didn't really want to do that because people don't really buy SaaS products that way. I don't go to Salesforce or Office 365 or Box or whatnot and say, how many connections do you have? How much bandwidth do you need? Right? Because that's more focused on, for one, people being in a particular location, and it's just not the way that you're buying a SaaS app. So instead, we've tried to keep things very simple and focus more on the number of apps people are using and the number of users that you have. So it's a simplified thing like that with add-ons for capabilities like CrowdStrike malware scanning or whatnot. So there are some additions as well.
When you say apps, I'm guessing you're not referring to Facebook. You're referring to the CASB capability for API.
Yeah, so
okay.
Two things. One is for the outbound browsing, there's basically a license for this Smart Edge Secure Web Gateway, and that's just licensed by users. For sanction apps, we go more like by app. So
okay. When you say user, I have a Mac, iPad, and an Android phone.
Right.
Is it one license or 3 licenses?
It's one.
Okay, so every user have some kind of number of devices, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so whatever it is, 2.6 on average or something like that. You go back and you say, this is a one user. So because I have 5,000 users at a small company and maybe 100,000 at a large organization, that license equates directly to the users, which is much more tenable from an understanding perspective during procurement.
Yes, and it's very important to know what you get before and not after. Architecture, because we podcast about architecture. So Mike, you want to share your screen to show us some slides?
Yeah, I got a few slides here that I can talk about the architecture. So give me 1 second.
And because you mentioned cloud, I guess you're going to explain to us how your cloud infrastructure works and all the...
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. So I'll get into it a little bit here to start, and we can follow on if necessary. So this is somewhat of a high-level diagram, essentially associating the convergence of cloud security and network security and whatnot. And I've talked about this kind of at the beginning, but this is a good graphic and visual to understand a little bit of that, combining together to provide a SASE-based solution. From a perspective of the architecture, what we basically wanted to do was not really copy the existing types of legacy approaches that existed today with things like forwarding traffic from a particular location or putting a box on a network. And so what we decided to do was push down the perimeter to the actual endpoint itself. So our outbound browsing solution is actually quite different than some of the others. What it does is it takes and it puts this Smart Edge proxy down here on the actual device itself and does the secure web gateway type outbound browsing lookups there. So we're not just tunneling traffic back to a point of presence in the cloud. Instead, what we did is we took the capabilities to do that lookup and say, hey, you're going to this URL. Is this a threat? Is it associated with malware? Is it associated with the violation of an acceptable use policy? By doing actual termination of the SSL sessions on the endpoint. And so it's quite unique. No one's really doing this today. And the idea behind it is that it focuses primarily on reduction of things like latency. So since you're not doing the backhaul and you're doing it actually locally on the PC itself, you're able to make these decisions rapidly on the fly without having to do any backhaul, which is quite unique.
Couple of questions here, if I may.
Uh-huh.
So, do you download the entire URL filtering database on the client, or it's dynamic and it's updating as you go?
It's dynamic. It's like a cache, basically, that has TTLs for the lookups. So may it be a category that falls into the example I used earlier, like social networking or something like a web-based email, then we know what that is as things go forward. So a media app, maybe I go to CNN and browse it for a while, or New York Times or something like that. We're not continually going to the cloud to do those lookups, but then when the TTL expires, then we'll go do that again. So we have a cache locally built on the endpoints.
We have a number of questions about outbound browsing, so we'll touch base later on certain capabilities like sandboxing, bandwidth, URL blocking later on. Okay.
So to go a little bit deeper, the difference here also is that we have this SASE fabric that we've rolled out that is composed of global core data centers, local edge data centers, CDN caches, and the smart edge endpoint agent. And so what's going on is we took basically this global core data center that existed for our SASE, our CASB product, and have merged it basically with the secure gateway SASE components. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the local edge data centers. So basically what's happening is someone will log in and they will start accessing whatever websites they're going to, right? And they'll contact the closest and lowest latency local edge data center or CDN cache associated with that lookup. And then it kind of all spreads around the globe so that there is the closest possibility from a DNS load balancing perspective for servicing a request on the fly. Obviously, the closest possible is on the endpoint itself, which is why we're talking about pushing that perimeter to the endpoint. But this is really all over the globe. So distributed everywhere, we have things like the CDN caches and whatnot to speed things up. But the primary infrastructure here is a combination of these global core data centers and these local edge data centers combined with the local lookups that are happening on the smart edge endpoint agents themselves on the PCs.
When the computer boots, it will try to find the closest local edge data center, or when I start to initiate the connection?
When it's on the request, basically, it'll do that. So it's constantly looking and changing if things change. So say I boot up and I'm at a headquarters office, I shut my machine down and I go to a different place and drive an hour away. It may not enter the network from the same local edge data center at that point because I've moved. So it's not like it's a static thing. It changes dynamically on the fly.
Great. We'll have more questions about this later. Was there anything else you want to show about the architecture?
No, I think that's good for now.
So how fast you identifying such connection and can make a decision of if that connection is allowed or you would like to block it? Like, do you have some metrics there?
So basically you set up a policy and the policy is synced down to the end device. And it's doing an evaluation to say, this is a gambling site that might not be permitted, or this is an adult pornography site that violates a acceptable use policy, or this is a link that's associated with spam and might be a phishing link or a malware dropper or whatever. So those lookups happen on the fly, and they get enforced right there on the agent if it's deny. If it's something more like a deeper inspection, something like a DLP, that could be something like a keyword or regex type pattern, arithmetic type counting, exact data matching, or something like a file fingerprint, or doing something like an inline malware analysis with an AI type engine like a CrowdStrike or a Cylance or a Bitdefender type approach, then that actually uses something that's a little bit different that's called a dynamic split tunnel, where if it's being denied, it denies locally. If it's going to do inspection, then we'll send that up to the cloud through these edge data centers into the global core so that we can do the enforcement and provide the availability and the uptime that's necessary, because some of those things are a little more heavy. You don't want to necessarily push down all that thick and intensive processing that you're doing for DLP and anti-malware to the endpoints themselves, because that would degrade performance.
You mentioned DNS in the beginning.
Uh-huh.
So would you also look on DNS, or you mainly look on the web traffic right now?
We're mainly focused on at the higher levels. We're not providing something like OpenDNS or anything like that currently. One of the things that's a problem with something like a DNS-based control is that you really only see the domain. And so one key thing that we've seen and is happening really rapidly is that in 2020 there's something like 80% of the traffic being HTTPS and encrypted. And so if you're not doing SSL decryption and looking at the actual full URLs, then you're going to miss a lot of things. And hackers have taken notice of that. Something like 40% of the attacks today are coming across well-repudiated domains, so something like a box or a SharePoint or whatnot. And if I'm only looking at the domain of that, it looks like it's good, right? But it could be a malicious thing that's hosted there in one of those vendors, and people are really doing that today, which is a huge threat.
Yeah, there's also the factor that a lot of talk about DNS over HTTPS.
Mm-hmm.
Then nobody's actually sure what's going to happen with the DNS traffic. I don't think there's...
Or TLS 1.3.
Yeah. Yes, this is an interesting topic as well that maybe we can talk later about it when in our open conversation. Great, let's move on.
Yeah, so we would like also to understand how would you tie back the user identity and how you would integrate with two-factor authentication, and also what would be the best practice for configuring different profiles for different job titles in the company, right? Because we might have administrative workers, we might have the executive, and also, of course, developers and technology workers as well.
Of course. So something that's actually kind of interesting from a story perspective is I mentioned back in the GA in 2014, we rolled out a solution and we tied into something that we developed and actually patented that's associated with a SAML relay where someone logs in and we're able to take that request that's associated with user identity and IAM and redirect it, right? So typically when you'd roll out something like an Office 365, that would redirect through let's say ping. And so what we've done there, though, is we realized that a lot of people back in that time didn't necessarily have that rolled out. So we actually built our own identity provider solution in the cloud. So we have an IDaaS solution as well. And so from an identity perspective, you can tie into sanctioned apps with SAML. If it's the outbound browsing type use case, just the identity and the login of the user would be tied in to SAML like that. But we also have Active Directory or eDirectory synchronization of users. We can do things like MFA. So when you were asking earlier about the profiles, for example, say I set up and I'm using Duo for 2FA, and from the context of the access, we determined that the user now is accessing from a new device we hadn't seen before, or a suspicious location, or they try to download a file and it's sensitive. We might want to trigger an MFA there. So we can do things like differentiate to, because we have software running on the endpoints, that the device is compliant or not. So let's say one day I'm running and using an antivirus vendor, and we can check that with the agent, and then malware gets on my PC somehow and turns that off. We're able to switch the bits there almost like a cloud-based NAC type solution and say, okay, now your access is controlled in a different manner because your context of your access has changed, be it from the device or the location or the activity that you're doing.
Is this came as a user request or it was originally by design? I'm wondering.
It was by design. So it's been one of the core features of the product for what, I don't know, 5+ years probably.
Oh, so, okay, originally.
Yeah. We've tied more recently into things like user-based UEBA, entity and behavioral analytics type stuff too, and so that can do things like trigger MFA as well. So it's been evolving over time, but yeah, it was a core feature of the product from the start.
Back to identity, I'm guessing if I'm HR or if I'm IT, I can have a separate policy because you're able to know based on my Active Directory, MFA tied back to Active Directory that you can do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, so typically people are syncing from their directory systems, either from something like Active Directory or using a SCIM-based integration as well, which is supported. So taking things from Okta or Azure AD or whatever you want to use from that perspective for a full cloud IDaaS type solution. But what we're doing there is we're tying into the groups that you have already created and used, so you can use them directly in a policy. If you looked at the policy, it looks kind of like a firewall. Where you have things like group-based matching, device-type matching, location-type matching, and then depending on the context of the security that you want to apply, you could use something like DLP or anti-malware as well, or deny the traffic because it's a violation of that acceptable use or a safe browsing type approach for the website.
The next question is around the scaling of your solution. I'm sure you experienced a sudden increase in the customer usage due to the COVID-19 situation. So it would be great to hear how you deal with that with such occurrences.
So scaling is actually something that's pretty important and obviously is a top of the mind for the end users. Do you mind if I show an example of this?
Of course.
Okay.
We like whiteboards,
So,
So diagrams is very close to my heart.
So what we have basically is something that we call a polyscale architecture, which is actually quite unique as well. What that is it's an ability to scale on the fly as load changes. So it stands for polymorphic scaling for this polyscale type thing. So basically what we've done is we developed this key technology that is stateless and multi-tenant and multi-app, so that between each node, as a load profile grows, the nodes actually clone themselves, but they do so in a stateless manner. We've seen that approaches from some of the competitors are basically focused on things that are single tenant. So they'll go out and roll out a solution just for customer A and a different set of boxes for customer B. We didn't want to do that because we're trying to do kind of a cloud-based service here. So our app is more, or our security platform is more like a SaaS app than a set of boxes combined together or VMs and whatnot. The other thing we've also seen is that other competitors and other approaches tend to focus on singular applications. So now I'm using Office 365 and it's across my entire user base because it's email and communication and things like that. And now I want to roll out something else like Salesforce or Box or whatnot. That might require rolling out a whole set of new infrastructure if you're talking about a legacy type approach to this. So this polyscale architecture is able to scale and kind of build up or sink down depending on for the number of machines that are and VMs that are and containers that are servicing the load for the end users. So as things change to typical wave type patterns happen, during the week the load is higher and we have more of these the cloning events occurring, and then over the weekends things kind of spin down. So they grow and they decrease on the fly in a stateless multi-tenant manner. The other thing that we're doing here, though, is providing the security through AWS. So AWS, being a public cloud offering, does things like updates their hardware all the time. So we're not going out and, especially in the COVID timeframe, trying to send our employees into colos or into our own data centers to go rack and stack boxes and whatnot. So a new customer comes on, we just provision automatically and scale up on the fly. Now, that's only one side of the capability, though. There's another component that's associated with networking and latency, which is very important. So by using AWS, we have avoided a problem that you see like this from a latency legacy architecture perspective, where you have a lot of hops between the end user, the private cloud SASE solution, and the application themselves. So here's a diagram basically that shows a local ISP, a bunch of networks, the private cloud SASE offering, and then the apps. And so there might be a lot of hops there and a lot of latency. What we've basically done is partnered with AWS here, which provides all these peering relationships between the local ISPs. So what happens is a user logs in from their PC, wherever they're at, say they're at their house now in this work from home era, and they get on there, the local ISP, it has this relationship and it gets onto this backbone of the AWS network where Bitglass is actually hosted as well, which services the request. So surprisingly, in places where the network connectivity isn't stellar, something like Latin America, for example, or some places in Asia Pacific, we've actually seen improvements to accessing their applications than you would normally see when accessing them directly. So we've seen things like the times increase without Bitglass and decrease, and the performance be actually better with Bitglass. So there's an aspect of this peering and this network effect associated with using a public cloud offering as opposed to a private one, and we're going to stick with that on purpose because it has really helped us out as we grow globally.
If I type what is my IP and I'm surfing through Bitglass, would I see as a company always the same IP, or it will change?
No, that's actually quite interesting because when we're providing this service here, the smart endpoint agent is sitting on the endpoint itself. So remember, we're not doing the backhaul like the typical approaches from others, where you might see the point of presence of, I don't know, Zscaler or Netscope or Palo Alto or whatever. Instead, you'd see the local IP of the user. Which is nice because then you can enforce policies and whatnot accordingly, and you don't have to worry about some of these confusions of where the user is. And basically it means that regardless of what's going on the network, we can still provide the security too. So there's no problems with things like proxy chaining, which come to be quite problematic with other secure gateway type approaches.
It's an interesting point because I heard multiple ideas here. Some say, oh, I want to know from which company or which IP you're coming if I want to connect to a partner, so I want the same IP. And some say, no, I don't really care about this part. The more move to SASE, to SaaS applications. It's just different approach for different companies. You kind of explain how you guys scale, and I guess this is how you make the experience faster. Will this also apply to Office 365?
Yes,
I know it's a big part.
It applies to all applications, be it a website or a sanctioned SaaS app like Office 365, Salesforce, Ignite, whatever it might be. So the realization here was basically that this we actually didn't really know that it was that unique until probably about a year ago when we started replacing some of our competitors' environments where they were suffering. And the scalability of this polyscale architecture and this network effect that I was talking about of reduction of latency by means of these edge data centers and the core data centers is really dramatic. So from an end user perspective, the thing that we want to do is basically be invisible, right? So we don't want to slow down the machine. We don't want to cause a whole bunch of memory bloat. We don't want to let the user even know that anything's happening until they do something that we want to block. So until they go to that link that they weren't supposed to click that happens to be a phishing or account harvesting type URL, and then they know, okay, now I see something here protecting my traffic. But transparently interacting with the machine and not being seen by the user is really key from a experience and deliverable and deployable solution perspective.
And vendors talk about unified management and unified dashboarding.
So from a unified management perspective, just like we were outlining at the beginning, this cloud delivered security platform, that's basically what we built. So you don't have to deploy anything on premises at all. Bitglass can be your platform for providing that security and that threat protection and that data protection, leakage control and whatnot, all from the cloud. So when someone logs into the Bitglass portal, it's basically a website for doing management. You can do the typical type things you might do if you had this deployed on a network like in the past. So you can do things like check to make sure that the administrator who's trying to administer the platform is coming from a managed device or a particular location or whatnot, or has their antivirus turned on, my example earlier. Once you get into the platform, you can do controls and set up policies and whatnot, but the dashboarding basically breaks down different types of activities depending on what the user is actually doing. So if you want to look at the outbound browsing type things, we have a web-based dashboard. It's called the dashboard web. If you're looking at more of the managed apps, like you were asking about Office 365, then we have an API dashboard and a proxy-based sanctioned app dashboard as well. So there's a bunch of different dashboards to look at. There's also obviously the raw log lines that exist for each of the activities that are maintained. And typically people aren't really logging into the platform every day, right? You don't want to have to log into this security provider. You kind of set it up and forget it, set it and forget it from, if we go back to the 80s. But when you think about it, you want to tie it into your SOC. So we have integrations with things like Splunk and QRadar and whatnot from a SIEM perspective, UEBA-based tie-ins and whatnot. And so all of our logs and capabilities can be synced out to whatever vendor it might be. It could be a SOAR vendor too. And then detect that something is a violation and go take action. So at that point in time, once I see that this event and this incident's been created that I need to go remediate, the administrator can go log in and investigate and whatnot. But it's designed to be something that you don't necessarily have to go in every day because of the tie-ins and the integrations with third-party solutions that everyone has in their SOC and NOC today.
Great. Let's move to more architecture type questions, even more. And my next topic is how you connect from the office, but I think you explained already that everybody connects basically using a client on the machine.
Right.
Because there is no IPsec, GRE tunnels pretty much created. Everybody.
There's no requirement for that. Obviously, in this work from home era, you don't necessarily, I've seen a lot of actual customers suffering from congestion on things like VPNs, where the old approach is where I have my security solution sitting in my data center, I have to turn on the VPN and backhaul that traffic, right, to provide that enforcement. That's not a requirement for us. However, if you do have devices that sit on your network and never move, like a desktop or a printer or other things, you might want to still provide security. So we do have a cloud-based offering that's tied into IPsec or GRE, the typical type approach you see. But then the agent is the primary solution for mobility, right? When someone's outside of the network, like we're seeing today. So while there's no requirement, there are capabilities to do that as well.
Okay. In this case, let's talk about more the remote user. Okay. What's the options? You mentioned about the agent. We briefly spoke about ports and protocols. So maybe go explain this again. what kind of ports and protocols are captured for the outbound traffic?
So from a web security perspective, people are generally seeing things like HTTPS or HTTP type lookups. There are other protocols and whatnot as well. We also support capabilities for things like connecting to sanctioned applications that you might have deployed that are only accessible inside of your data center, something like a ZTNA type approach, the private access type capability. So if it is an application, we can do the same type of reverse proxy solution that we've rolled out and that I was talking about at the beginning since 2014. But basically, what's going on here is we tie in on the endpoint. Regardless of where that user is, they can be protected. If it happens to be something like an iOS device, for example, then you might install a profile to do forwarding and protection. Whereas if you're using a Mac or a PC, then it's more like an agent. So there's a bunch of flexibility there, but primarily what we're trying to provide is something that is distributed, right? Is providing that security on those endpoints wherever they're at, so that the remote users are protected, regardless if they're in the office, at a Starbucks, or at their house.
You mentioned Apple and iOS. So I guess I didn't ask, do you support PCs, Macs, Android devices, and Apple devices as well?
So since the rollout of the SASE solution just happened in Q2 of 2020, right now we're focused on Macs and PCs primarily. But as we roll this out, we're rolling out a Android-based agent, as well as forwarding profile tie-ins for iOS with things that would be deployed through something like an MDM.
You mentioned about rollout. Is there a better way to roll out, or just use the regular techniques that deploy any application on the environment?
So I'd say that depends on the organization. So we've seen scenarios where places like universities don't necessarily have all the machines joined to AD, so they can't do AD group policies or SCCM or anything like that, right, for their devices for managing them. So we've seen approaches where people will take and will allow the end users to actually install the agents themselves to put them on the PC, and then we do the profiling and whatnot, and we can upgrade the agent and inspect it and whatnot. We also obviously support those other approaches where you take something like SCCM or AD and you push the MSI out for, let's say, a Windows 10 machine and install it. So there's a mix there, and both are supported. But the most common ones are probably the domain join managed devices and automated installation.
So I can go to Bitglass
interact at all.
website, download the Bitglass client, install on my machine, and then call my IT to help me configure it, basically?
You could, yeah. So not exactly. The administrator portal is where the agent is located. To obtain it is only available to the administrators. But in that university example, we've seen things where people will download the agent and host it on their own site with instructions of, hey, do this, then install something else. Maybe it's, I don't know, IBM BigFix or Cylance, an antivirus vendor. So you have all those things kind of combined in the machine. And then it's saying, oh, this device is compliant. So I'm going to secure it. So there are onboardings that are kind of self-help type approaches that are facilitated basically by the organizations themselves, as opposed to us providing that. But we've thought about that, and that's potentially something that we might build out as we move forward with this roadmap-wise.
How easy it's to remove it or disable the agent itself?
So that's actually critical. You don't want to say, hey, install this agent, and then the user is an administrator, and they just go uninstall it or stop it, right? So there's different types of capabilities to control that. There are things where you block uninstallation. So if you think about the typical approach that's associated with malware type solutions, anti-malware type solutions, where they require a password to uninstall, we followed that. So there's a mode that you can turn on that says, allow the user to uninstall this device or not. And so you can block that. There's controls around things like modifying the capabilities of the files that are stored that are associated with logs. So we kind of pull logs then and send them up at a periodic basis so they go into the cloud as opposed to one at a time every single event that's generated. So anti-tampering is really critical there too, or avoiding stopping or modifying a service as well. So focusing on the hardening of the agent is really critical, and making sure that even though I might be an administrator on a device, I can't stop it or I can't uninstall it is really critical as well, because otherwise you've lost everything that you've tried to gain from a security perspective by installing it in the first place.
You mentioned CrowdStrike and Cylance that you guys OEM some of their capabilities, I understand.
Uh-huh.
Does anybody OEM you?
There are a couple OEMs today, some white label type stuff. Right now, that's mainly associated with our Shadow IT based offering. So we have a couple people doing that and reporting and putting it in their own portals to display that. We don't yet have anyone doing OEM of the current SASE type solution, but that's a possibility as well. And we do have this is a little bit different than the OEM answer, but we do have a bunch of MSSPs as well that are providing the service and installing Bitglass onto the clients either via the agent or for the managed device protection that exists for sanctioned apps as well today. So there's multiple flavors of different scenarios where people have Bitglass deployed and managed in different ways.
Let's dive into the security web gateway. So I took Gartner's 7 or 8 categorization of what is defined in security web gateway. And because outbound browsing, it's in a way security web gateway, or at least part of it. So option number 1 is, can you block URL by categories? And I think you mentioned that you guys doing this with Webroot.
Of course, yeah. And our own categories from the Shadow IT database as well for that higher fidelity than just computers and internet info.
Part number 2 is, I believe, very important. Do you guys have a dynamic category for bad URLs? Something that you maintain that by default can be blocked? And if tomorrow this site become bad, it automatically will block because you guys don't use threat intelligence.
Yes, so that is provided primarily today through OEM type integrations. So that's normally through Webroot, as well as the combination of the zero-day malware and known malware type analysis that comes from the Cylance and the CrowdStrike and whatnot integrations there. So there are 2 things. We have been asked about things like bring your own threat intelligence feed from an end customer, either purchased or curated or whatnot from them. That's something that's on the roadmap, but right now we're basically providing it in the product without you having to do anything, so you don't have to bring it, right? But if you do have it, then in the future we'll integrate and allow you to use it.
So if the customer wants to, over API, to put their own block list, they will able to do it?
Right, yes.
What type of a format would you you have on the roadmap or requested to support for threat intelligence?
Typically, the integrations are things like REST API. So we have a REST API for the solution today that you can do things like provision users and whatnot. We have, I think this might come up later, but we have some stuff that is integrated with things like SOAR vendors like Demisto, where I might detect something that's bad, and now I put the user into a risky group, which might provide a different type of matching there. Policy management is also something that you might want to do. And so the REST API allows capabilities to push and pull data. So it's not just a pull type integration that you might do with a SIM, but it's also a configuration type change that you could push to us in a number of different ways, either through custom integrations or things that are offered out of products like SOAR vendors.
What will happen when I download a file and I'm not sure if the file is okay, malicious, or not malicious? How the architecture for scanning and sandboxing the file will happen?
So we don't support sandboxing in the inline solution because it's too slow, right? So when I'm downloading something and it's coming through the proxy, we have to make a decision on the fly, which is why we partnered with these anti-malware vendors that support this machine learning approach. So they built these models that are associated with dynamic analysis that says, oh, this right here is something that I've never seen before, or maybe a known piece of malware, and block it right away. So what would happen is there's an inline notification capability that you can turn on. It's not required, but it tends to be something people like, where they'll say, user, hey, we found that this device or this file has known to be a threat, and we've blocked it accordingly. And so there's that. There's also things like transformations that can occur. So from a DLP perspective, if it's not malicious, but it happens to be something that's sensitive, we might want to DRM the file, or we might want to encrypt the file, or outright block it. So those things are possible too, also coupled with notifications, if you like, to display that to the end user of why this happened and what has occurred.
So when you download the file, the connection still goes through your SaaS offering, I'm guessing, or when I upload the file?
Yes, so that was that dynamic split tunneling type thing I was talking about before. Okay. So for those operations that are associated with DLP and anti-malware that aren't URL-based blocking, that are more like file analysis, it goes through the cloud, through those edge data centers and those core data centers, versus the endpoint running some Cylance or CrowdStrike integration.
Okay, so the endpoint will able to detect it's a file download and switch the connection for go to the data center to check it.
Yes.
You mentioned DNS security, and the DNS can only see URL and cannot actually see more than this.
Right.
So that's why it's different. What happens
Yeah, that's actually critical.
Yeah, if I'm on a website and I'm browsing, and part of the website is malicious, or maybe there is a link or something else, or a flash, what's the capabilities you guys have to detect such problems and help users there?
So everything is essentially funneled through the Smart Edge agent on that. So all the requests that happen are being inspected, unless, of course, you have a secure gateway policy that says go direct, like something like don't inspect my health and medicine type sites, or this is an exception that I don't want to look at, or maybe this domain is associated with a thick client application that's doing certificate pinning, and it would break the app if we were to try to inspect it. So you have all those different flavors of controls, but basically what's going on is every request that's happening on that web page, be it an ad that's malicious, like you mentioned, Flash or something else, or maybe a drive-by download type thing that someone has installed from a threat perspective, will be seen as a request that is analyzed by the agent. So that the URL gets looked up, the full URL, because we're doing the TLS inspection as well as the HTTP. And if it is bad, then it basically blocks it on the fly by means of the policy that you've configured in the cloud.
Since you guys coming from a CASB background, I'm guessing whatever I browse, whatever I go, will appear in the shadow of IT report later on.
Right. So yeah. So basically, like I talked about those web browsing dashboards, there's also another dashboard that we have, a discovery dashboard, which is analyzing the traffic of basically the sanctioned applications that people are using and breaking them down and scoring them with something we call a cloud score. So we have our own categorization database and whatnot and do that. So the integration shows firewall type logs that you would typically see when someone's doing all the accesses and what action was taken and all the statistics around who they were and what their IP was and what their machine was and whatnot. But then that also breaks it down to show you, oh, this is a web browsing related versus discovery related versus proxy related versus API related, and all these different dashboards that we have provided again in the cloud.
Great. We're almost done with the questions about secure web gateway. Bandwidth shaping. How can you help users to lower the YouTube or have priority for Office 365?
So right now, we're not really doing prioritization per se. You have a hammer really at this point where you want to say, hey, if I dislike the use of the bandwidth hog that might be Netflix these days, you can block that on the managed machine, but you can't say QoS it down to only a few megabits of traffic. So that is something that has been asked, but is more coming from the other side of SASE. That's something you see from the SD-WAN and the firewalls and service type vendors that are trying to get into the SASE market from the other direction. So we're coming from the CASB and the secure gateway type side, as opposed to the networking level type side, at least at this point, just because our platform is more focused upon that. But that's something that we're thinking about for the future. Although right now you can do the blocking outright to control some of those. If you didn't want to allow a user to go to Spotify and stream music, for example, you could do that. I don't know if you're just like that, but you could do it.
DLP, it's a very popular topic lately, information leaking. I'm guessing it was available as part of CASB, but probably
yeah, so
enhanced.
The DLP engine that's used with SASE is the same that's used with and Secure Gateway with CASB. And so that's a custom built DLP engine that we did ourselves. And so we didn't want to go take an OEM type vendor and require that when I have a feature request, we have to wait for them to implement something. So we've built a really robust DLP system, actually. Keywords, regular expression matching, things like counting, things like even if then or not type statements and whatnot exist all natively in the platform. We can do things like file fingerprinting, where we have a piece of software that you can download and you can point towards a folder and say that these are maybe financial services related documents versus something that is POs or media related and hasn't been quite announced yet from a marketing perspective. And then you can use a percentage confidence score to say, is this new file that we've seen, let's say 70% similar to the fingerprint that we have for that file? In examples like healthcare, we see things like financial services and healthcare tend to be one of the ones that are most deep with DLP. Exact data matching is really critical there. So we also have a piece of software there that can go sync with the number of records or fields that you have from a PII perspective, and then count them in a document. So if maybe I see more than 50 records, which would violate a HIPAA violation for a hospital, you can say block or protect, right? Or quarantine the file through an API. So the DLP is something that we've built and we continue to evolve, and also have things like OCR and whatnot. So it's pretty rich.
I guess when we do part about CASB and DLP, we'll talk more about DLP because it's not a 5 minutes conversation.
No, yeah.
Because I have a lot of questions about tagging, file types, so we'll leave it for future.
Yeah, that's interesting too. We support classification as well, where you can actually extract tags that may have been applied by AIP or Titus or Bolden James or something like that. But we also have an ability to actually go classify the files themselves and add those metadata tags with our solution. And then you can enact on policies associated with those tags later, either through the proxy or through even an external product. So it might have a, I don't know, proof point type secure or mail gateway that's also extracting those tags and comply actions. So classification is something that's supported too.
Gotcha. My last question about this part is inline cloud control that you kind of touched already. I don't know if anything to add about inline CASB here.
So there's two pieces. The outbound browsing piece is typically talking about managed devices where I have this Smart Edge agent installed that I've been talking about repeatedly the whole time. But as I mentioned kind of at the beginning, we have the reverse proxy as well. So our reverse proxy actually allows you to tie into applications without any agent. So if I'm, say I get a phone call from my boss and they want me to look at some presentation that we really have to send out to, I don't know, Gartner or Hirschbeck or someone like that. We go look at it, and I can do that from my spouse's PC or a friend's PC or a hotel kiosk in a business center because the reverse proxy can tie in through that SAML relay, that patent that I was talking about earlier, and have you not actually install any software, but protect the access. So maybe I can view the document from an inline reverse proxy perspective, but I can't download a copy because I'm on that hotel kiosk. So you can still do your job and interact, but you don't necessarily get any requirements to install a thick client or whatnot.
So conditional access pretty much.
Yeah.
Awesome. We're done with the questions about Secure Web Gateway. We have a few questions about POC and integration, and we can move to open discussion.
Yeah, so let's say I were a customer looking for such solution and reaching out to you, how would they, POC, how would they test your solution? What's the process?
So our POCs can happen really rapidly. Basically, you just go out and request a trial, and we provision a tenant for you. So that can happen in a number of minutes, actually, from the request perspective. We also have resources if you wanted to help with a test plan creation or even things like RFPs too. But if you go and request one today, we can be talking with you and walking you through the solution in a matter of minutes.
Would you tie to an IAM during the POC, or usually do it with the static users?
It depends. So it depends on the appetite of the customer. We do have customers that will do POCs that actually install the AD agent for synchronization and tie into Okta or Ping or whatever. That's not a requirement. There's also a capability if you don't have a test application. So if you're talking about CASB and you're trying to replace O365 with some security solution like Bitglass, then you may not have another tenant that you can use for that. So we have something we call a Jack and Jill tenant that you can come and we give to you to use, which is basically an O365 instance that you can provision and use. So for the outbound browsing, though, there is no requirement like that needed. You can just come and install the agent and create local users as well. So it depends on the depth of the POC you want to get into, but it can be really simple and can also be quite deep.
You mentioned integration already, so elaborate a bit more. Who do you guys integrate with on a technical part?
So the ATP side has a bunch of integrations with CrowdStrike and Cylance and whatnot. On the source side, we have integrations with Splunk and Palo Alto for Phantom and Demisto and whatnot. We can integrate with any SIM. Basically, we support syslog format. We also have deeper integrations with some of the SIMs, things like Splunk and QRadar, to actually install an application on the fly like that. From a Shadow IT discovery perspective, any firewall basically, or really anything that generates traffic from a networking perspective that has a source IP, a dest IP, a timestamp. It can be used date and time to do visibility there. Obviously, if you have a URL, it's better because it gives a higher fidelity of what's going on in that report. That's possible. From an IAM perspective, I mentioned Okta and Ping a few times, but it's really any SAML2 compliant IDP. It could be even open source Shibboleth or OpenAM or whatever, it doesn't matter, or they could use Bitglass as the identity provider. API-wise, we probably have integrations with, I don't know, 20 plus different main applications that have well-built APIs like the Boxes and the Salesforces and the Office 365s of the world. For our reverse proxy, what we've done since we've been doing this since 2014 is we've genericized the capabilities for that reverse proxy so we can actually support any application. So it could be a fringe app or a niche app or even your own app that you coded and wrote yourself. We can provide reverse proxy controls there too. A little bit different than outbound browsing, but I'm sure we'll touch on that in a different topic session for another podcast.
Yes. Great, almost done. Couple of questions about reports. So what are the popular reports your customer like to run?
So we have automated reports that can be enabled that go out. Typically, those are showing value of the solution to things like directors and the CISO and whatnot. So there's a capability to go, and I walked through the different dashboards you could look at earlier in the podcast. But there's also an ability to have PDFs emailed to people, and you can control that to be reports or alerts that get sent out to people's managers if you wanted to. It could go to the IT staff or to people in the SOC team as well. So there's a bunch of rich opportunities there. We also have integrations to create tickets inside of external vendors like a ServiceNow, for example. So we can send an email that can then be parsed that creates a violation or a malware incident that needs to be triaged and inspected and whatnot. So there's a ton of stuff going on there.
You mentioned CISO. Is there any metrics that you can show to CISO that your solution is doing well, that your solution is doing what needs to be done? Or do they ask you when you sell it, how do I explain that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing?
Right. So on that web dashboard that I was talking about, there's a breakdown of things that are associated with the top categories of things people are doing from a categorization perspective. So there's 92 different categories associated with that are broken down. There's the top categories that have blocks going on, the top users that are being blocked, the top users that are downloading malware or that are violating DLP, for example, exfiltrating it, for example. There are the top patterns that are matched. There's something called a class of categories. So because 92 is a lot of different categories to look at, they're broken down into 10 different high-level things like legal risk versus questionable versus security violation and whatnot. And so you can see all of that at a high level, but then at that 10,000-foot view, you can also drill down if you want to into the 100-foot view and whatnot, or the 10-foot view to see what's actually going on. So there's a transition there that occurs from high-level reporting that may happen and be reliable and helpful for a CISO versus something where I'm an administrator and a SOC guy that's sitting in there and has to do the actual triaging of the individual events themselves.
If I am a CISO and I need to present to a board, which report I will take with me to show the board?
You take that 10,000-foot view report. You probably combine a few metrics and show them there across, because typically people are buying not just this secure web gateway type component, but multiple things at once. So SASE-wise, they might have threat prevention as well as CASB as well as a secure web gateway, and you could combine all those metrics into one dashboard to look at or one report to look at and present to the board.
We're done with the official questions. Anything you want to tell more about Bitglass? Share. That's not a part of our original questions that we want to talk about.
Well, one thing I think you need to be very aware of when you start doing evaluation for this, and you're thinking about buying a SASE product, secure gateway and whatnot, is performance. I talked about the polyscale architecture where we're using the public cloud and we have all these integrations that are happening on the endpoints themselves, happening at these edge data centers and these core data centers that are global. So performance is really key. But performance is only one thing. The ROI is actually really important as well. And this may seem a little bit different than what you might have thought I was going to say, but return on investment is really critical. So when you think about retiring and replacing legacy equipment and boxes and whatnot, you want to be really aware that if I am required to deploy a bunch of things on my network, or I am now having to go in this complex dashboard that's not really simplified and easy to understand, I'm wasting a bunch of time with management and analysis that I could be using to actually do things that really matter, right? You don't want the platform to get in the way of doing your job from a SOC and
it's a good one. So what will go to ROI? Time, network, like give me some components that when you help
management
customers.
Overhead, maintenance is not required because it's all offered through a cloud-based solution. Deploying, you're not having to deploying everything. So what you really want is this simplicity of management and this simplicity of also that user-based type licensing as well, where you're not having to worry about where the users are and how big the network pipe is that you've allocated to that particular network, or the number of now that I want to do SSL decryption, let's say on my box, my performance drops to 1/10 of the performance it did before. What you want is something that's purchased and can provide that solution by just flipping a switch and turning it on, which is what we've developed in our platform.
You mentioned SSL. I wanted to ask TLS 1.3.
Yeah.
Is there an issue for you guys?
No. So from a TLS 1.3 perspective, there was one point in time in the RFC where they were saying, hey, we're not going to allow any inspection of a man-in-the-middle type traffic. That's been dropped essentially since then, because otherwise you get no visibility into what's going on. So what we're able to do is we're able to terminate traffic, be it TLS 1.1, 1.2, or 1.3, inspect it, look at the URLs, and then take an action. So if it's that gambling site I gave an example of earlier, we'll block it. If it's not and it's web-based email, maybe we'll inspect the traffic and whatnot. And that's all happening on the endpoints themselves, as opposed to forwarding them up to some cloud that may or may not scale depending on what you have deployed from a competitor.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I think this was great. Thank you for inviting me, and it went quite well. So, feel free to follow up with us. We'll send a number of different types of resources that you can access to get more information. And we have a number of white papers and webinars and other things that are available online as well that we'll provide links to.
Please remember to subscribe to our podcast and join us for our next episode.